Can I welcome members, officers and the public here in the gallery or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Can I start by asking our clerk, Maria Burton, if any apologies have been received?
Yeah, none received.
Thank you, Maria. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No. Can I ask the committee to note the membership and chairing arrangements for this committee as listed on the agenda? Thank you. And can we note the committee's terms of reference as listed also on the agenda? Thank you. Can we note the standing delegations of authority to me as the chairman of the committee as set out in the agenda? Thank you. And can we confirm the minutes of the Budget and Performance Committee held on the 19th of March 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Can we note the completed ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and additional correspondence? Thank you. And can we note the action taken by me as chairman of the committee under delegated authority following consultation with then party group leaders to agree the committee's response to the Mayor's 2021-22 GLA group budget consultation? And can we also note the reply from the Mayor in the papers that have been tabled at this meeting? Good. So now we come to today's main item of business, which is a discussion of the Mayor's manifesto commitments. So I'd like to welcome our guests, David Bellamy, who is the Mayor's Chief of Staff, Richard Watts, and it's nice to see you, Richard, none of us have met you yet, the Mayor's Deputy Chief of Staff, and Enver, Assistant Director, Group Finance and Performance for the GLA. Welcome, all of you. As is usual, I will start off with the questioning, if I may. And I'll start to you, David Bellamy, if I may. The Mayor has a shortened 3-year term. How developed are your plans to deliver his manifesto commitments?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Of course, we're now 5 weeks into the term, and I think I would describe the process we're going through as something like driving a car while rebuilding it at the same time. So obviously the Mayor appointed his team on his first day in office, including Richard, who's now been with us for 3 weeks. We've launched the restructure of the Mayor's office, and the consultation for that closes tomorrow, and HR anticipate that we'll complete the appointment processes there in July or maybe in August, depending on people's availability, things like that. We've been working through making many of the board appointments that need to be made, and also the appointments that need the scrutiny of the Assembly. And we've been working on evolving some of the processes that we're going to use, including, of course, Richard and I establishing how we will work together. While that's been going on, officers have been analysing all the commitments in the Mayor's manifesto. Clearly, some of those are, in their nature, bigger or more pressing than others. And what we as a Mayor's office are working to in this early stage is really 5 priority areas, which are, firstly, getting London back on its feet. So we're looking at, obviously, reopening, particularly in the central activities zone, Transport for London funding, jobs and skills. Secondly, safety, looking at, obviously, serious violence, but, of course, the ongoing COVID response and building safety as a very significant priority for us. Thirdly, the Green New Deal, obviously air quality with the ULEZ extension due in October, but also the Mayor's actions to address the climate emergency. Fourthly, affordable housing and other physical infrastructure such as East Bank. And then finally, our work trying to give positive opportunities for young people. And so, those are the core things the Mayor's office is focusing on in these early weeks.
Okay, I mean, there are headline issues that you've mentioned. They're all very plaudable, I must say. But there are over 280 commitments in the Mayor's Manifesto. You told us you've got your staff in place, as it were. But how confident are you that you'll be able to deliver on all these commitments during a shorter three-term period?
Well, of course, the first thing it's fair to say is that the Mayor knew it was a 3-year term when he wrote the manifesto. But at the same time, I think we'd all agree that London, like the country, faces some huge challenges at the moment. And, you know, the manifesto, clearly in that context, I believe is, you know, a big one, and thus the challenging to deliver in the time. I think there are two risks that I would particularly highlight as being very worthy of consideration. The first is the risk that with a 3-year term, inherently you have less time to react, identify issues and recover if you do hit problems. And so there's a necessity, I think, to be, you know, even more closer to what's going on key deliverables. And the second thing I would flag is uncertainty. So clearly we have very real uncertainty about the future path of the virus and the measures the government will take in response. We of course saw that, didn't we, yesterday evening. We also have, well, you know, directly relevant to this committee, very real uncertainties in a financial sense. So if you think back to 2016 when the Mayor was first elected, we had a 4-year funding deal in place with the government following the previous CSR, and so we had, yeah, a large degree of certainty, whereas obviously the situation that the Mayor inherited walking in was in general, yeah, funding in place until March 22. We expect a CSR later this year, but absolutely, you know, no knowledge of course at this stage of timing of that, let alone what the outcome of it will be. And of course the Mayor inherited the challenges regarding to TfL finance, which the committee is very familiar with, and, you know, clearly there is a long way to go on that front to get TfL back into a sustainable place given the loss of fair income we've seen. And so those really are probably the two areas I would pick out, Chair, as the big challenges.
You said that the Mayor was well aware that it was a manifesto for 3 years, and he was obviously well aware of the problems that there would be around COVID because he made it at that time. So do you think that actually having so many pledges to deliver in a 3-year term is not of itself a problem, to have to actually it will present a certain level of challenge, there's no doubt about that.
Absolutely. I guess the first challenge we're going to have maybe is agreeing the number of pledges. I don't have kind of my number, but 280 is possibly more than I thought were in there. Leaving that aside,
confidence, Mr. Bellamy.
Well,
I'll send you a list.
We're going to, yeah, we don't want to spend our morning having the debate about what is a pledge. But what I would say is that, yeah, clearly, given the situation London's in, it's right that the Mayor takes an ambitious approach, because we've all got to be ambitious. Absolutely, the goal is to try and achieve everything in the manifesto. Clearly, some of those things are things, where, full delivery would be beyond a 3-year term, and the manifesto will be clear about that. But absolutely, we want to go for it, and we will have to just deal with the challenges as we encounter them.
Would you like us to send you a list of the pledges? Because we had problems in the last term where our remembrance of a commitment or a pledge wasn't quite in line with what yours were. So shall we send you the list that we've got and then dispute them at the beginning, not rather all the way through and at the end?
I think I can see a great merit to having, if you like, a single version of the truth there. we probably need to get a little into the Mayor's office restructure to get some of the team appointed in terms of who'll kind of lead on that for us. But when we've done that, I'd be very happy to do that, yes.
Excellent. Well, Gino, if you'd like to send the Mayor's Chief of Staff a list of the commitments that the Mayor made, that will be helpful for all of us. What did you think are the key lessons that the Mayor learnt from his first term that you'll take forward into the next 3 years in terms of delivering manifesto pledges? Clearly not making lots of pledges that weren't pledges, but I mean, what are your key lessons?
I think probably the key lesson I would pick out, I don't want to sound like Harold Macmillan, but is about events. And clearly COVID-19 was exceptional, but even if you put that to one side, I think the thing we learnt through the last 5 years is that whether it's the awful accident at Sandilands or the terror attacks or Grenfell, they both at the time take focus away and time that otherwise would have been spent on delivery and proactive policy development implementation work. But they also create new ongoing challenges that we didn't know we had, that rightly will take time of the Mayor and the administration to address. Clearly, one of the things as we think about Grenfell following the anniversary yesterday was how much we've all learnt subsequent to that about the state of the built environment in London and the real challenge that is out there, and that then has become obviously a real focus for the fire brigade, but also the GLA as well in terms of all our building safety work. And so that's really one of the very big things. I think if I take a second point, it's maybe slightly more positive, maybe an opportunity, is that what I think COVID-19 has done is really crystallised a pan-London desire for greater collaboration and working together to deliver things that perhaps people, if you asked them a few years ago, would have always said, but they were possibly a bit more focused on their own priorities in their own institutions. And I think the scale of the challenge that we've faced really is through the Recovery Board bringing everybody together with a real incentive and desire to collaborate more and work together on things. So that will create its own burden, if it's like, and its own challenges, but I think it's also an opportunity that it's worth noting.
Thank you. I mean, do you think that the Mayor's 2021 manifesto set out a clearer vision for London than the manifesto that underpinned his first term?
I don't think I would say that. I think they both set out a very clear vision for where we were at the time, and I guess that speaks obviously to the point of events, because it was was it 7 weeks after the 2016 election in which the Brexit referendum was held, and that obviously led to a range of very significant changes and impacts on the city, and that just I think speaks to my point about a manifesto necessarily is the best vision that each candidate in the election can set out for what they want to do at the time, but London doesn't stand still for the mayoral term of office while we get on and implement it. And clearly, in being elected, a mayor is elected both on their pledges and their manifesto, but also what that says to Londoners about their ability to react to challenges that may occur during their term of office.
Thank you. I'm glad you've cleared that the people are elected on their promises and their commitments. And that's why we're particularly looking at these in this meeting to see what the Mayor has promised so that we can hold you to account, which is our job. If you look at the Mayor's manifesto, have you identified which commitments are not included in the 2021-22 Mayor's final budget, or indeed the plan for 22-23?
I think I would possibly break the commitments down into 3 categories. Firstly, many of them already are in the budget. Of those, clearly a lot will be multi-year commitments, things that won't all be finished this year. And that obviously plays into the point I made earlier about uncertainty around the spending review and the resources available to the Mayor in future. The second category is things that are, broadly in the budget, but the focus of them will evolve and change slightly, given what's in the manifesto and how things may have moved on slightly since the budgets were first put together. And thirdly, are things that, are not in the budget. And what I would say in general is that, the manifesto was written by the Mayor with the financial situation in mind. And so I think in the general case, those commitments will tend not to have, very significant short-term financial consequences. And as I say, officers are working through analysing all the manifesto pledges at the moment, and that will then lead us, both at the GLA and as necessary in functional bodies, to consider whether any in-year repurposing of budgets is needed, but also they will feed into the budget process for next year, which will be getting underway in anger in about a month or so.
Do you have any understanding of how many of the Mayor's commitments would require either additional funding raised at the GLA level or would require financial support from government?
No, as I say, officers are still working through and doing the analysis, so I don't have something that would set that out.
Have you totalised the cost of commitments?
No, because what we have to do is go through that process of analysis. The Mayor's confident in the deliverability of the manifesto. As I say, it was written with an understanding of the financial picture as at the time when it was produced, and we're working forwards on that basis.
But surely when the Mayor was making commitments, manifesto pledges, you would have had to have looked at the cost of those pledges. You can't have let him go off on his own and say, I pledge this, that and everything else, without the financial implications being known to you, surely.
So I think we need to be very clear here, Chair. The Mayor puts forward his manifesto for election as a candidate, in this case on behalf of the Labour Party. This is not it's not a GLA publication, and of course GLA officers don't work on party political matters. And so the Mayor will have produced his manifesto based on his understanding, just as all the other candidates in that election will have done. As I say, given that that was the framework with which the Mayor put his manifesto together, he will have confidence that we believe it to be deliverable within the current parameters we face, but it's not something that GLA officers would have worked on to cost up for him.
No, but if we take it back, the Mayor has made commitments. Somebody's in the job already, so he knows the sort of costings around it. Are you actually telling me that none of his manifesto commitments have been actually costed up before he said that he'd go ahead with them?
Well, as I said, Chair, many of them are already in the budget, and some of them are broadly in the budget, and things, there will be marginal change, and then there will be some that are not, but in general they are not material in the context of the overall resources available to the Mayor. And so that's the approach the Mayor took in developing the manifesto, and that's what gives him that reassurance.
Well, this doesn't give me any assurance at all if nobody seems to know if there's any costing for the commitments. I mean, in rough terms and very broad terms, bearing in mind this is the Budget Committee, how much do you think, very approximately, his commitments will cost?
So I'm not going to put a finger in there of that. The development of the Mayor's manifesto and the work behind that is clearly a matter for the Mayor and the Labour Party, and not something that I, as an officer of the authority, can comment on. As I've said, officers are working through doing the analysis now, and I've set out to the committee that I believe that the clear majority of the Mayor's pledges are things that are either already accommodated within existing budgets, or something very similar is, and the repurposing will take place.
Okay.
So that leaves me to have, as the Mayor has, confidence in the deliverability.
Okay.
But until, we will work through development, and of course, we're not trying to deliver every single manifesto commitment in parallel. We don't have the resource to do that. So some things will need to be pushed forward than others, and costings will come through that process as we take each promise forward.
Okay, so if you've got officers working on how much the commitments that the Mayor made to the electorate, and as you said, people are elected on their promises, that's what you said, and you're quite right. When will you have a figure that you can report back to this committee of the costing of the manifesto? Now the Mayor is in place with his promises, his 280 promises, when will we know the costing of those commitments?
As I said, Chair, it will be an incremental process, and so we have a high-level analysis taking place now. I would expect probably in about the next month or so that will be in a point where we can say, okay, are there any material repurposings needed in the GLA budget for this year? And then other matters will just come forward through the new development, the normal development process in the years ahead.
Well, can I ask you to write to us then, please, me as chairman of this budget committee, as I can send round to all my colleagues when you actually have that figure, because clearly it's going to be very interesting. That's what the Mayor was elected on. We'd like to know how much it's going to cost. Thank you. Assembly Member Duval.
Very much. You mentioned earlier, David, about events, and events come in all shapes and sizes. So since the election, I think I can think of two events that have happened. One, the TfL settlement, and the other, the announcement yesterday of the delay in opening up the rest of the pandemic regulations. So what impact could the uncertainty of those two events have on your recovery plans and possibly set delivery timescales and KPIs? Are they flexible enough to take this into account, or will they have an impact longer term on delivery?
I think what I would say is that, firstly, in terms of thinking about the CAZ's reopening, clearly we recognised that the dates the government had set out, they never were, dates this is happening on. They were the earliest possible dates. And as we saw with the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday, there always was the possibility that there would be delay if the government felt that circumstances made that right. So obviously we have designed programmes such as Let's Do London to be flexible. Of course, that creates some delivery challenges because if we knew we had to wait, for instance, until the 14th to push go on things related to the next stage of restrictions being eased, which was expected on the 21st, well, question, can you get just given the mechanics of production and, booking, advertising and all that sort of thing, can you get all that done in the week? And that's, as we've gone through the kind of previous stages of being reopening, that's clearly one of the challenges. And then, I guess beyond that, the other thing we have to ask is, what is the impact of the delay on the operation of the authority, the ability of officers to work, the ability to hold, meetings, events, work with partners and so on. And so there will be a range of impacts, which obviously, project to project we'll be trying to mitigate. But we're no different, I guess, in that respect from any other organisation in the city who has to adjust their business in response to the changed situation.
Thank you.
Would you like to proceed with the next section?
Yeah.
The next section is about the economy.
Okay, so we're going to deal with the economy in this section. So the manifesto states the Mayor's economic priority is to protect, preserve and help to create jobs, that he will use all the levers he has to do this. So what are the key levers that the Mayor will be targeting? And two, how many jobs will the Mayor be planning to create during this mayoral term?
I'll take that one. So, firstly, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. My 4th week in the job, and it's so the Mayor made jobs his priority all the way through the election campaign, and yeah, there's a number of different levers that are directly in the control of the Mayor and the Greater London Authority grouping. There's also a significant number of levers that through the Recovery Board and the Recovery Task Force, which I chair, and through the Mayor's wider convening powers that we can try to deploy on Londoners' behalf as we try to get through the enormous economic problems that the pandemic has created. So if we're looking at some of the direct levers, then already there's clearly the adult education budget that sees 20,000 Londoners earning below the London Living Wage access training. We've also got the £32 million Good Work for All fund that delivers training, education and employment support for Londoners. And use of that adult education budget, where I think where we're seeing quite significant churn in the labour market, some sectors of our economy moving quite quickly downhill and actually being replaced by other kind of jobs, but making sure Londoners are reskilled and re-equipped to take the new jobs as the economy changes shape through the pandemic is absolutely critical. And Deputy Mayor Pipe is working hard with the FE sector and the other training providers in order to shape that retraining and reskilling offer in order to make the training that we fund fit for a post-COVID economy. There is another aim, and I think this is job number one actually, is to try to save as many jobs as possible in the first place. You quite rightly, if I may say, identified the economic risk that comes from the government's announcement yesterday. The Mayor was very clear that, well, understanding the public health evidence that led to the delay, he strongly supports there being further business support to protect as many jobs as possible that are now further imperilled by a 4-week delay in reopening. I think it's been very clear in the feedback that we have got, and I'm sure you will have picked up as constituents and London-wide representatives as well, there's many businesses that are teetering on the edge, particularly in the hospitality, entertainment and cultural sectors, where an early reopening was enormously important to them to pay back debts that have accrued during this crisis, and that's now not going to happen. Another 4 weeks of profitable trade lost is a big problem, and we need that level of business support coming in. However, I think it's important that we can do what we can within the limited resources we've got to try to get as much activity in the central London economy going when it's kind of safe and proper to do so. So the £7 million Let's Do London campaign I think is important, both about driving more people from the rest of the UK to London, but also about trying to support London's businesses by getting people, Londoners into our city and back spending money again. And I'm sure that's a thing that we can all wish success to. The Mayor's work around sector and skills academies is important. We announced only a couple of weeks ago that we were adding hospitality to the list of skills academies that we were trying to set up, because we know the hospitality industry is an enormous employer in our city, but it's also struggling, enormous struggles economically, and therefore as much support that we can provide to the sector skills academies that we can, but adding hospitality to that list I think is an important intervention the Mayor can make. But I think there's also a whole range of interventions that we're seeing through kind of longer term stuff, and the Green New Deal is one that springs to mind. I won't get into all of them, but kind of longer term changes to our economy that we both can start now, but we need over the next decade or so to drive the kind of economic change that we need, where we can get that kind of investment in green jobs, green infrastructure and other things that will both kickstart our economy, but also make the kind of progressive change that the Mayor was elected to deliver. There's a whole range of other tools which I'm happy to go into in questioning. So I'm sure you want me to go through.
Perhaps you could write to us about that. But can we just come back to about jobs created, jobs saved, and the nature of London? So it's just not much that we're quite interested in what we can say the Mayor has achieved. Some of it he can achieve on his own. Some of it he needs to achieve in partnership with others. So are we going to be in a position at some stage to actually indicate how many jobs have been protected by interventions either by you, government, local government, I think they're the agencies, or you could say other public agencies as well, around that. Will we be able to have some figures from you?
So
And
we,
then what jobs are protected and what jobs are created? So Green New Deal is one where I'm thinking we might see jobs created, but also we might see some skilling up in some areas.
so to a degree, we can measure some things, but I think not everything to that level of specificity. So I think the frank answer to your question is there are things we're measuring. So for example, there is measures we're putting in place around the success of Let's Do London, where we're measuring the GVA that campaign creates as a good metric for the success it creates. It's very hard then for us to, without an enormous, frankly spending more on measurement than you would on activity, for then measuring the job in particular hospitality business that campaign has saved because it's got more people into the city, without doing incredibly expensive surveys of all London businesses and stuff like that, which actually business owners don't like because they're too busy running a business to fill them in. So I don't think it's possible to give a precise number of jobs saved. What we are trying to measure is some other metrics of success, because I know this committee, I'm told this committee wants to look at metrics, and we're very happy to try to provide that as we can. But so things like GVA feels to me a more proportionate measure of the success of some of these campaigns. But I think the reality is also it's very difficult to measure a hypothetical. So measuring the number of jobs saved, we don't know. Yeah, it's hard to measure what might have been lost had the campaign not happened.
I didn't want to say jobs saved and jobs created, but equally, okay, so maybe you could write to us about your emerging thinking on that, and therefore we could think of whether there's any further questions to come back. But given that the construction industry and government makes great play on that, they can tell us on every planning development or every development the jobs that could be possibly created out of that development. There must be a way that we could do that and extend that to other sectorial activity. But let's await your paper on that. The people that we might be giving subsidies in and taking, I think the Prime Minister's phase of building back better, how are we going to work with partners throughout London and in particularly anchor institutions to increase the take-up of the London living wage and good work standard?
So I think the answer to that question is, if I may say, in two parts. I think first, before we get on to the details of the anchor institutions, which is, I think, a really exciting bit of work, you're right to say the real power of the mayoralty sits not just in our ability to spend the budgets we have, but in the ability to convene. And through the Recovery Board, I do, and I say this as a former borough leader, the ability to convene the power of London, not just the mayoralty and the boroughs, but also business, voluntary sector, civil society groups that sit on that board, I think is a really powerful emerging way for the city to get business done. And it doesn't just belong to the mayor, it belongs to all of the members of that board. And I do think that the way in which that board has shown that working, the real power actually of the convening power of the mayoralty in working to get work, because I think the point you said is right, that actually, if you look at the budget that we have compared to the combined power, budgets of the boroughs on all of this, actually far more spending power sits in the boroughs than it does with the GLA, and making sure that we're all aligned in that spending and we're all working to the same strategic objectives and making sure that we can therefore get best value for taxpayers out of the collective spending in the London state, I think is really critical. On the anchor institutions point, which is I think a really emerging bit of work. So if we're talking about the levers the mayoralty has, and actually developing this network of anchor institutions is a really powerful lever covering some of the biggest employers in London, whether it's the NHS, the Metropolitan Police Service, the University of London, TfL, and a whole range of others, is to effectively get us all working in an aligned way. And I've always been struck that for public bodies, it's not just what we do that matters, it's how we do it. So the levels of pay of which we pay our staff matters to the outcomes we're trying to generate. Because if we're worried about ill health, for example, well, we know people on poverty pay tend to have worse health outcomes. So upping our pay is a really good health intervention as well as it is a economic intervention as well. So the work on building that network at the moment concentrates on two groups: young people, support for young people, and helping Londoners into good work. On support for young people, we're linking that into the mission around opportunities for young people to ensure we have apprenticeship, mentoring opportunities, ways of engaging young people in some of the work of the anchor institutions. And in helping us Londoners into good work, it is exactly that, which is using not just these institutions as payers of London living wage, and I think almost all, if not all, are London living wage accredited, and if not, we are working on that. However, use those institutions as advocates for paying the London living wage, for good jobs, and frankly, for spreading the good work standard and definitions of good employment through the wider economy, because I think it's important for politicians to advocate for that kind of stuff, but frankly also hearing from employers who've gone down the journey of moving to being a living wage employer, finding actually it has far more business benefits than costs, I have found in the past to be a really persuasive way of persuading more businesses to take that up.
So we're going to do some of that.
We are.
Good.
We do. There's a really good bit of work doing at the moment with Bloomberg Associates, as you know, do work pro bono for the Government of London under this and the previous mayor, who are looking at ways of developing this. And I think London isn't the first organisation to this kind of, first city to do this anchor institutions approach. It started in Cleveland in the States and is now pretty used regularly across the world as a tool of governance. Preston, although much smaller, is a good example in this country. But I think this is a pretty tried and trusted way of now significantly upping the leverage with which we have out into employers.
Okay. So where have you got to on developing a set of key indicators and targets that will be used to determine whether the economic recovery programme is successful?
So we aren't there yet, but we are working through on effectively to try and find some of those metrics. We've got metrics for some of the individual spending programs that I mentioned. Let's do London, but ultimately employment rate. There's publicly available figures around employment rates in London, around some of the indicators that most matter to Londoners. So we are doing some work early as part of the Mayor's Manifesto around creating that suite of indicators, but ultimately, we're not short of indicators in this area already, and therefore the public figures around the economic health of London are pretty widely available and published nationally as part of our statistical returns.
Okay, and so let's go back. But on one of them where you must have something at the moment, and I think was mentioned by David Bellamy earlier on, is the Let's Do London campaign. So attached to that, and any scoping of any campaign, we would have some set of goals of what we want to set insofar as monitoring the progress of this campaign. Now, I accept it's relatively new, but what can you share with us about what those goals might be at the end of that type of campaign? It may be not at the end, at some concluding phase before you move on to the next phase.
Well, the Let's Do London campaign is about £6-7 million of spend over the course of the rest of this year. That's basically split into two elements. Number one is a drive to get more domestic tourism to London, and number two is a drive to get Londoners themselves coming back into the centre of our city and spending money again. So there's a combination then of effectively marketing activity to advertise that London is open when that is, when we're free to do all of that, but also kind of working with a whole range of institutions to do things like London Eats, celebration of hospitality and restaurants, London Light, which we're working with kind of museums and cultural institutions in order to get us on. And it felt that this was the kind of nightlife and cultural work as well. It's an important kickstart to get the economy going. There's been very significant business collaboration on the Let's Do London campaign all the way through, and and I think there's been a strong demand, a strong call from business on the Mayor, on the GLA and on the kind of recovery board structures to do something that really gets, advertises very publicly that London is open again for business. And I think we would have been frankly criticised strongly, and probably rightly actually, had we not done the Let's Do London campaign or something very similar to it, given the demand for people and to get London back on its feet. So the main metric of the Let's Do London campaign is a GVA metric, which is, as I've talked about earlier. So again, we are looking carefully at visitor numbers as they come in as well, and we've got a programme of activity stretching for the rest of the this calendar year that is, I think, relatively well set out actually, that is around spending that budget in a way that we can make sure is effective.
Okay, we might come back to you and ask for more information around that in terms of following up in a written form following this meeting. Can we turn to the Olympics? So during the mayoral campaign, the mayor announces a bid for the Olympics. Has there been any money allocated to that campaign for a further bid for the Olympics? And can you just tell us about some of the rational thinking about why that might have been the case, the importance of why we need to bid, and also sort of some assessment of whether we would be successful, given that it would be very unusual. Maybe pandemic it might not be, but pre-pandemic it's very unusual to get another bid so close to the successful Olympic Games that we did. And it is the Summer Olympic Games, not the winter one we're bidding for.
I'm assuming so, yes.
I should know that because it should be there implanted on my brain. So can you just quickly comment on the Olympic bid? And again, we might follow up with some more questions on that.
I think that's right. So clearly we're in the middle of hosting an existing major international sports tournament, the Euros, and that's there's clearly confidence in London as a host of major international sporting tournaments. That the fact that we're hosting so many games for the Euros shows, and I think broadly the London Olympics was considered one of the most, if not the most successful Olympics of all time. Where we are specifically on working through the commitment of that is the commitment was to study whether a bid is viable. So we are looking at putting together an Olympics commission. There is work going on that means quite quickly after the Euros is over and the lessons we can take from the Euros, that we'll put together effectively a scoping piece of work around the commission. And it's that commission that will then look at the question about the viability of the bid, both financially and also whether it's viable for London to be a host city again in future. As I say, the broad sense from listening to people is the 2012 Olympics was such a success, and the post-COVID, appetite for staging major international sporting tournaments, might potentially change across the globe, and therefore it's certainly worth us having a very good look at whether London is a viable host city in the future. And that the scoping work for that will take place quickly once the Euros is complete.
And is it just about the Olympic bids, or would you be looking at other major eventing issues? One of the successes of the Euros already is working with its partners. Maybe FIFA wouldn't entertain it, but a European-wide bid for the World Cup at some stage.
I think we are interested in anything like that. That brings more tourism to London, brings more sporting, world-class sport events to London. That brings the enormous benefits to London that hosting, major international sporting events does. So I think we have always got a close eye on where there are opportunities. And then, although it's somewhat before my time, I do know, because I take a somewhat close interest in football, that we did move very quickly to try to get as many Euros games here as possible, and it's quite clear that some of the original host cities were unable to do that, hence why London has got, I believe, more games here than anywhere else.
Okay, and just then moving on to another topic, let's concentrate on a section of Londoners at all levels, from graduates to those who may leave school without qualifications and whatever. The offer in terms of the economic recovery programme, what is the offer to young Londoners who may have lost their job or are about to enter, or who were about to enter the job market in some ways? when the pandemic struck. So what's the offer that we're thinking of that's going to be specific that I need to look at in the streams of the economic recovery programme?
I think there's two or three things I would particularly highlight in all of that, but I think you're absolutely right to identify that problem, and it's and as some of the work on the recovery mission around a new deal for young people works its way through the system, and some of the further work on that is emerging. However, I would also flag that through the No Wrong Front Door programme that we're funding through the adult education budget, and I think we all recognise the structural problems in the current programme of employment support and training that exist in this country, the fact that very often it's unclear who people who aren't used to navigating the system should go to support. I think that's particularly helpful, getting some clarity running through where people go, what advice they're entitled to, and where the best place for them to go to training and education would be an enormous step forward for Londoners, given how impenetrable large parts of the current adult employment support and training is. And I think that's enormously important. Again, there's partly the GLA to deliver some of that through our adult education stuff, but actually, again, it's a convening role working with partners to try to get that clarity running through the system. I do think that's a particular benefit to young people. We're also working on a range of mentoring programs, which I think understanding the importance that mentoring can provide to young people in the particular, in these circumstances, but also in that in the kind of the reprogramming and the reprofiling of a lot of the adult education support around where we think jobs are going to be of the future rather than what's traditionally been provided, then again, that's clearly going to be of disproportionate benefit to young people as well. But the recovery mission, which is, as David said at the beginning, a priority for the Mayor and for the whole of the Recovery Board around a new deal for young people, I think needs to produce something that's absolutely tangible for young people across our city. And that work to put the flesh on the bones of what a mentoring programme might look like from that is carrying on now with the new mandate the Mayor has.
And let's go to the other end of the sector then, the over 50s. Recently the Assembly had a discussion around that. What's the offer for the over 50s that we know will be coming back into the marketplace as well? Have we got any offer on that, or are we developing any offer for that experienced work cohort of people?
So I think there's a number of things. Again, without meaning to rely overly heavily on the adult education budget, but I do think there's over £300 million of expenditure. It's an enormous tool the Mayor has, and it's absolutely critical for that. I think you've identified, rightly, the two biggest priority groups for that. I also think some of the skills academies should come into play at this point as well, because we do know that for some of those people returning to the labour market or needing to retrain later in their career, that the opportunities to do so are into jobs that can see them for the final stage of their career are really important. And a lot of those skills academies, which again are based around where we think employment opportunities are going to come in the future rather than where they've necessarily been in the past and what people have currently got the skills, confidence and experience to do, can play that role in retraining people and supporting them to make a relatively late career shift. There's various bits of details I'm happy to write to you about relatively early in my tenure around the ways in which the National Skills Fund and the ESF work that we co-finance can specifically start to make a difference in there. But there is quite a lot of tools that Jules Pipe is currently trying to work through in this area in collaboration with the FE sector and others.
This is a sector that we've just inherited that's already had cuts from central government, but also is notorious about its inflexibility to meet actually real issues at the real time, and it's hard in an economic recovery situation. So what thinking is going on about that flexibility? And can I just add my last question in? So we're coming to the end of what should have been. I mean, they should be quite rigid structure funds from Europe. We're coming to the end of those. The replacement scheme is called the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. I think should have in brackets, according to government, excluding London. the question then is, what are we doing about that new fund? Because that may give you some of the flexibility in the skills agenda and that retraining agenda, both for the over 50s and those emerging into the workforce. What work are we doing about that, and what's the intelligence around London's positioning around that new fund?
Well, at the moment, so you're absolutely right. So just to make sure all committee members are in the same place, the UK SPF replaces the European Social Fund, which London has been a generous beneficiary of over the years. The original UK SPF prospectus didn't favour London as a recipient of those funds. That does seem to be something that is surprising, given levels of poverty, unemployment, and economic challenge affecting many Londoners. And I think all of us know that this is not a city paved with gold, and therefore we got ESF money for a reason, because there's an enormous deprivation and challenge in our city, and we need SPF money to replace that. The Mayor is very much trying to build bridges with government post the election, and I think if the government wants to build bridges back, then a pretty good indication of that would be how it wishes to extend London's kind of prioritisation around bidding for some of that SPF, UK SPF fund, because we would want to make sure that Londoners, I'm sure collectively, want to benefit from that funding. It's incredibly important. We don't have any further details yet of how the UK SPF will work, and we are awaiting, as I understand, response to the original prospectus that, as I say, did seem to deprioritise London in the funding order. And obviously we will continue to make whatever representations we can to make sure that Londoners try to get the best deal for Londoners out of that.
Okay, and just, I suppose, finally going back to David about budget commitments that may exist in 21, 22, 22, 23, if you can't, are they, to what extent are they funded, this work, or is some of it still to be added in? If you could, I mean, maybe if you can't answer it now, maybe you could write to us about what's in and what's out in terms of the budget commitments on the economic recovery programme.
David, can we have that in writing?
I mean, we're obviously happy to write as described. It's there's a process that we're going through at the moment to look at where things need to be repurposed slightly, and happy to share the outcome of that when we get to that point.
Okay, thank you. Mindful of the time, gentlemen, if I could ask you to keep your answers slightly shorter. Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you. Richard, I just want to ask you this sort of follow-up question. We talked earlier on about the uncertain times we live in, and also the impact it's having on central London, on the hospitality industry, on theatre and all this industry. And yesterday, the new lockdown won't open up till at least till 19th, rather than even that, maybe just be relaxing the rules rather than a total opening of lockdown. But my question is this, that the support given to these industries hasn't been extended by the Secretary of State, okay, by the Prime Minister. And when asked the question why, we were told that £1 billion is lying in the coffers of local authorities, which can be used to support these industries. Do you recognise that figure? And do you recognise this money being underspent in the local authority budgets?
No, I don't recognise that figure. No, and clearly that's national. I think the government will be talking about a national figure as well. And to be honest, although I was until about 2 months ago chair of the LGA's Resources Board nationally, I'd need to refresh myself because there's been some pretty dramatic changes to local authority funding in the 2 months I've been out the picture as well. However, I think my recollection was quite a lot of that was very specifically around business rate support rather than broader government support as well. And there were very tight criteria on that fund, and many local authorities were doing their level best to pay that out. But because of the restrictions on the nature of the fund, we're starting to run out of grant claims to pay those grants to. And I would encourage the government to show maximum flexibility if that money is allocated, is out there, to support local authorities and organisations like the GLA, if that money is there, to spend that money more flexibly rather than the quite tight definitions on which that money can be spent at the moment. I'm not aware of many businesses coming forward to either the GLA at the moment or coming forward to local authorities in my old life saying we're eligible for a grant and we haven't got it yet. I mean, there was about 19 different business rate support programs running simultaneously for a while, and local authorities that earlier in the pandemic were struggling with capacity. I think those issues, as I understand, are now less so, and therefore I think money is being paid out. There are just limits on the number of eligible businesses to get that money, and the government needs to, which I would urge the government, if that money is allocated and distributed, to be as flexible as possible in these circumstances about how it's spent.
Good, thank you, Richard.
Okay, thank you. Very, very briefly, can you tell me where the funding streams come from the Good Work Fund? David, you'll probably know this.
I think it's a combination of flexibility in the adult education budget and also some additional government funding off the top of the head is my recollection. But we can confirm that in writing, certainly.
I'd be grateful because there was a press release saying that the funding is, and I quote, in addition to the £318 million adult education budget, but the budget itself says that the AEB is almost 350 million. So I'm just wondering if there's top slicing going on there. But if you could write, I'd be grateful.
Happy to clear that up in writing, definitely.
We'd need to know that. Also, just to comment on the previous section, I am very concerned that given that jobs, jobs, jobs is the mantra, which is absolutely right, there does seem to be a lack of ability to measure the successes or not. I'm very unhappy about the GVA metric because I think it's speculative, and I've had issues with that with London and Partners on numerous occasions. But
I think, Chair, if the committee wants to make some positive suggestions about effective ways of measuring it, we'd be very happy to consider them.
okay, well, we'll come back to that. We're more scrutinising what you're doing, but you will want to know yourselves how well you're doing, I'm sure, because there'll be a press release immediately about it. But we want to make sure that it's an accurate reflection of what's going on. So we're now moving to transport, so I'll hand over to my colleague, Assembly Member Pigeon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's start off. We obviously understand the situation Transport for London's in. The Mayor has stated that he wants to end the temporary changes to the congestion charge, but we know the budget for TfL for this year has the current situation fully costed for the whole year. So what are your plans around this and timescales? The Deputy Mayor for Transport has previously talked about having a consultation in the summer that you would have to have whether to make these changes permanent or to make some alterations. So what's your position with that?
Yes, so as the Mayor's said, that the changes that were brought in subject to the funding agreements with the government, TfL's been keeping them under review, and the Mayor's asked them to bring him proposals about what the best congestion charging arrangements would be for a strong economic recovery in London, one that's environmentally sustainable and fair to all. The Mayor's expecting the proposals later this summer from TfL, and as you rightly say, the next step, if the Mayor's happy with what TfL puts forward to him, would be a public consultation on that.
So you say later this summer, and I know in local government and national government we talk seasons. What do you mean by later this summer? We could say we're in the summer at 25 degrees outside. So when are you expecting this consultation to launch?
So I don't yet have a date on that. Obviously, that's dependent on when TfL complete the work, whether the Mayor's happy that it's in the appropriate state to consult, and then the mechanics and legalities of the consultation process. As you'll appreciate, this is an area that's subject to very careful legal review by people who don't necessarily like the congestion charge. And so TfL will have to approach it with suitable care in terms of ensuring that the processes are followed properly.
And in terms of this review, obviously it has significant financial implications, but are you looking at every aspect? Because the changes that came in extended the hours, it got rid of any residence discount and so on. Is that all going to be looked at before proposals put to the Mayor?
So yes, TfL will look at all aspects of the changes in developing their proposals.
Okay, but if you did go ahead and end the current situation, the changes, it's going to leave you with a shortfall of, I think we estimate, between 67 and 87 million. Oh no, hold on, is this, I'm just reading my question differently. I was to fund concessionary fares, it's saying here. How would you address this shortfall?
Okay, so
Yes,
I
because
think,
this is being used, isn't
right.
it, to part fund the concessionary fares? Yeah.
So there are two issues there, aren't there? Let's try and just separate them and clarify the situation one by one. So in terms, firstly, of congestion charge income, yes, TfL obviously has a budget assumption about what that income will be this year, and then that may change dependent on, firstly, the extent of changes that are implemented post-consultation compared to the current scheme that's in place. And secondly, obviously, when those changes were implemented, because the earlier in the financial year they're implemented, the more impact that will have. As part of the October funding deal with the government, the H2 2020-21 funding deal, the government said that the Mayor needed to raise additional money to fund what for shorthand I will call London-specific concessionary fares. The Mayor chose to do that through given the limited tools at his disposal, through the combination of a council tax rise and then the balance being met through the congestion charge income. Yeah. Now, from memory, in order to achieve the expected cost of those London-specific concessions in this financial year, it was only expected to need about 6 or 7 months worth of the additional congestion charge income. Yeah. And so it doesn't seem that there would be any issue in terms of meeting that and I guess now slightly historic stipulation, because it's a couple of funding agreements back, but there's no issue with us meeting
So
that.
if you bought it in mid-year and you consulted and bought it in, changes that meant perhaps you're reducing the amount of income you were going to get from congestion charge, it won't impact on the concessionary fares.
So yeah, we would still be meeting the condition of that, let's say, historic funding agreement.
Yeah. The funding agreements, goodness me, I do feel for the senior management at TfL and on this, because all their time is spent focusing on these negotiations. But the recent third package, TfL has got to find a further £900 million of savings, or this could be new income, new revenue, this year, compared with their approved budget. Now, the Commissioner has said this is achievable, but he also said to the Assembly last week, you're not expecting passenger numbers back up to 90% for a very long time. We're not expecting them to be back at 100%. How confident are you that it's achievable, and what are you looking at to make these savings or increase revenue?
The first thing to say is that passenger numbers obviously is the biggest variable, as we all know, in terms of TfL's income and TfL's budget, but it's not particularly a consideration for this savings exercise, because the nature of the current funding agreement with the government is that there's a mechanism in it that allows the money from the government to adjust in either direction based on what actually happens with fares income. So, the funding agreement is based on a particular baseline of what we would, of what the government expects to happen between now and December, and of course what happens will be very much driven by government decisions, as we were talking about earlier in the meeting. And so you can put that to one side when you think about the savings, and I think you're absolutely right to say it's very, very challenging, and it's absolutely not where we would want to be, but it's what the government insisted on. The statutory office, in terms of the Commissioner and the CFO at TfL, do believe that it is achievable. If so, they wouldn't have been in a position to accept the government's deal, given their statutory obligations. And the way we think we'll get there this will be set out properly in detail in a revised TfL budget that will go to its board on the 28th of July. And so obviously the detail of all this is being worked through and will be set out there. But the broad areas that will be looked at are, firstly, I think passenger numbers have run a little bit better at times than was expected, and through some other delays and cost controls, TfL's cash reserves are above the £1.2 billion minimum level of cash that they need to maintain. So there's some funding available there. We expect a slightly better position in terms of business rate retention, and obviously, importantly, we've got the details now of the government's 75% loss compensation scheme for 2020-21. TfL expects some costs will be lower than anticipated in the budget, because where there'll be areas, because obviously with all the uncertainty, TfL's got very tight cost controls in place, and so they've been spending money at a lower level than they budgeted. So we'll look at that. There will be some deferrals on capital expenditure. Some of that will mean delaying non-safety critical asset renewals, or just burning things up and slowing them down at different rates to get us through that. And just generally there will be ongoing tight cost control. So TfL's view is that with a combination of those measures, they can deliver the savings required by the government.
Some of that is sort of accounting measures, slowing things down. I mean, it's quite technical really, rather than completely stopping doing things. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly, a number of things have been necessarily paused because TfL, as you know, runs assets that are, have 40-year lifespans, and yet TfL has been working, has been lucky to have 6 months certainty of funding, and so in that context, it's very difficult, and the TfL officers have clearly had to take an appropriate approach in terms of not committing expenditure when they don't have confidence in their ability to meet it in future, and so that necessarily means that some things can shift to the right or proceed at a slower rate than they and the mayor would wish them to do.
Okay, in the last month I noticed that the Santander Cycle Hire sponsorship deal had been extended to 2025. Is this going to generate additional income over and above what the current sponsorship arrangement is? Are you able to provide details?
I'm not cited on the terms, to be honest. I don't think it was a transformational change, but obviously you'll be aware of the enhancements to the scheme that are associated with that as we start the rollout of electric bikes, which will be a very
so I wonder
welcome
perhaps you could let us know if there's what income is coming in from that, whether there's anything above what we've had previously. Now, in terms of the Mayor's manifesto, and a lot of it, quite rightly, transport's long term, is stuff that's already in the transport strategy and in the plans at TfL. And one of the things we particularly noticed is the issue of lobbying the government for London's fair share of government transport investment, absolutely right. And then when the time is right again, prioritising the Bakerloo line extension and Crossrail 2. When do you think the time will be right again for those, or is that just showing that you're committed to them, but they're very long term now?
Well, I mean, firstly, it does show the Mayor's commitment to the schemes. I think in terms of timeline, the first thing we've got to be clear on is the path to TfL's financial sustainability. Clearly, the government wants TfL to be there and not reliant on funding from them by April 2023. That's, as you'll know, somewhat easier to state than actually deliver. And clearly a lot of work ahead, as you were saying, dealing with that. I think it's the other aspect of that is as we get certainty on the operating account there, we also need to get certainty on the capital account. And part of that, and I think the Transport Secretary has again recognised this recently, is that the cost of the really big investment schemes, just before we get to things like Crossrail 2 and Bakerloo Line extension, the cost of the necessary replacement of our rolling stock and our signalling are things that are going to be beyond the capacity of TfL to fund, and there needs to be government involvement there in the same way that there is in terms of funding for rolling stock for National Rail, and that's that's the right thing to do. And so one of the areas under the funding agreement to be looked at is TfL's capital programme, how we can ensure that it's always as efficient as possible and that we've got the right priorities. Part of that is about long-term certainty of funding, so that we can take the most efficient approach to maintenance and make, therefore, reduce the kind of refit costs and maximise the lifespan of these really expensive assets. And then when I think, coming back then to your direct question, when we've got certainty about the approach for that, then you're in a space, say, have a conversation. Well, what are the opportunities then to push on with these longer term, bigger ticket projects? Obviously, we'll be aware in terms of Crossrail 2 that early thinking involved looking at business rate supplement and MSIL and so forth, but they've now been committed until circa 2040 for Crossrail 1, and so and the tools in the mayoral kitty are clearly very, very limited, and so it's inevitably going to be about a discussion with government at that time. We welcome the work of the Transport Secretary in safeguarding the Bakerloo line extension, and discussions are ongoing at the moment about updating the safeguarding regarding Crossrail 2, and we welcome that as as both the right thing to do to ensure the schemes are viable in future, and as a sign of the government recognising their importance. But clearly, given I've talked about the transport picture, there's also a very challenging national financial picture, of course, as well, and so it's certainly one for the future.
So no time soon, which is understandable. I don't know if you saw on Sunday the Politics show, and Stephen Greenhouse, former deputy mayor for policing, and when he was asked about TfL finances, he did say that what he thought was a mistake. And he was asked about taking away the revenue support grant of £700 million a year, and he said that it was a mistake to not separate capital from revenue, and it was a mistake of the then leadership of TfL. Well, then leadership presumably would have been Boris Johnson as well as chair of TfL. Do you agree with that? I mean, it is slightly complicated how TfL's finances work. It's quite different to other bits of the public sector.
Well, TfL is, I believe, the second largest organisation in the public sector, and there are, it's in a way it's a slightly technical question that I wouldn't be best placed to answer, but there are certain clearly things about the local government finance regime that TfL operates in that is not well designed for such a capital-intensive business as TfL, and so part of what TfL said in the financial sustainability plan that we put forward to government is, we do need to look at this and look at, what the right model is, and, the desire for a longer term, we need the operating account to balance and to work and to respond to the risks we face. Because clearly, COVID-19 was existential for TfL, but the 2015 funding model creates this real reliance on fares. And if we hadn't had COVID, we just had what we previously regarded as a really bad recession, then it would have been a really difficult situation. It might have been harder to get the government to understand that exceptional support were needed. And so that's, we have to get that right. But then on the capital side, we need a lot, long-term certainty of funding so that we can maintain and renew capital assets in the most efficient way. And I think it's a fair, if I was being critical about the 2015 settlement, like I say, it's more that it didn't consider the impacts of the economic cycle.
Yes.
Yeah. But beyond that, I think there is a point that we have to get things right in terms of the long-term stable capital funding.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. One of the things that's been talked a lot about around all these discussions with government is vehicle excise duty. What is the current position on that, and what other options are TfL looking at here? And in terms of long-term financial viability of TfL, I mean, VED would only be relatively short-term. Are you considering things like road pricing?
So, firstly, in terms of VED, the government is very resistant, as colleagues will know, to the devolution of this. There's one aspect of this in which I have no sympathy with them. There's another in which I have a great deal of sympathy. I have no sympathy because I think, as I believe is a consensus view, certainly under the previous Assembly, that it is wrong that drivers in London contribute towards the costs of roads outside London, but drivers outside London do not contribute to the costs of roads in London. I just think that is fundamentally wrong. The thing where I do have some sympathy with the government is that they've taken the decision to hypothecate the VED income towards Highways England, and that was part actually of giving long-term multi-year certainty of funding for Highways England's capital work, which of course is just the same thing that we want for TfL. And I can see that it's challenging for the government to say, well, different people in the ministerial chairs, but in years gone by, we didn't get that quite right because we ignored the fact that Highways England does virtually nothing in London, and that the strategic road network there is maintained by TfL. We will continue to make the case, obviously. What the funding agreement, latest funding agreement requires is TfL to go through all mayoral powers and essentially consider all possible options around ways of generating income. And so, as part of that exercise, TfL will need to, to some extent, consider everything. The government's frame, as I say, is around things that could deliver more revenue from April 2023. And obviously then one gets into, both legal processes we talked about earlier, but also, operational and technical considerations. There undoubtedly will be some schemes one could devise that might be within TfL's legal powers, but wouldn't be implementable by April 2023. And so, that is the piece of work that TfL with the DfT will have to undertake under the conditions of the funding agreement.
I think TfL had already started some work on road pricing. I'm sure workplace parking levy, of course, is another potential is a power that the Mayor has. Finally, can I just ask you, one of the strange assets that TfL has is the cable car, which obviously many of us will be using to commute to work at the end of the year. But it has a 10-year sponsorship deal that runs out in 2022. What work is going on to consider whether TfL should keep that asset or look to sell it as a tourist attraction, or to look for a better sponsorship deal?
The understanding I have of that is absolutely, this is pre-pandemic, I think, was the last time I had a discussion with anybody about TfL about it. I think it was the then Commissioner, and absolutely at that stage there was an intention to think about it on the basis that you set out. And I guess one has to take a decision and say, is it fundamentally a public transport piece of infrastructure that may perhaps get more use as the Royal Docks grows and more people go there. Yeah, indeed. I'm anticipating using it a lot more than has been the case in the past. Or is it more kind of tourism related? TfL clearly is a public transport operator. It's not a tourism operator, and so absolutely TfL will need to be thinking about that in the run up to the end of the current sponsorship deal.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to stay on transport. Can I ask you to keep your answers as brief as you can,
I'll
please?
try.
Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. I've got two brief questions. My first one is that you've been asked to review the bus services and frequencies to make them, I quote, match demand better. Now, is there, that's by the government, is there a risk that cutting services and frequencies would further reduce demand and actually make those bus services effectively more expensive to run?
There's clearly a risk that cutting bus services would impact demand, particularly when a number of Londoners will be understandably nervous about, getting in, in close proximity with strangers. And we know, obviously, that we're talking about the Delta variant at the moment, but we know that there will be more variants to come. So, clearly there's a risk about that. Elasticity of, to take the economic perspective, elasticity in terms of income and costs definitely varies by route, and it also obviously varies by passenger mix, given the importance of concessions to usage of bus routes. So it's probably a complicated thing, but absolutely there must be the potential that that's the case.
Bearing that in mind as that review is undertaken.
Absolutely, and the Mayor has a very clear recognition on the importance of buses and their importance to our economy as well, and with buses and with the tube as well. What we'll be making very clear to the government is that if you want people to be coming back into central London, you need to have the public transport services there that enable that at a time when we don't necessarily want to be kind of, cheek by jowl, pushed up
Thank
together.
you. I'm going to pause you there because I know Susan's otherwise going to get very cross because I had one second question, which is about investment in walking and cycling. Now, in the 2020-21 year, before the pandemic, there was a plan to spend 471 million on healthy streets. The outturn from the year, it was more like 154 million was spent. So that's 320 million pounds down on spending on walking and cycling measures. Now, what's the current assessment of the need for investment in walking and cycling? And has it changed after the experience of rolling out Street Space, which was doing much more temporary measures?
I don't think we have an update on the kind of strategic need. I think, clearly the case for it is very strong. In turn, we've seen that in terms of the health benefits and other benefits. Clearly, given the financial challenges facing TfL, we won't be able to invest in it to the level that we would ideally like to. But we will do all we can because it's so important and a pivotal part of the Mayor's transport strategy and other strategies. And what's possible for this financial year, we will set out in the TfL revised budget at the end of July.
I think if I...
If that's all right, there's a bit of a sense of deja vu while I'm talking to you about active travel schemes. It is that I think we've learned an awful lot in the last 15 months about how you do these things at pace and at significantly less kind of unit cost per scheme. And I do think we need a pretty fresh bit of thinking around how we do all of this in light of the lessons of the pandemic.
Thank you. The thing I'd ask you to consider is junctions that's the difficult bit, and that's the bit that is more expensive and is going to need continued investment. Thank you, Chair.
Move on to housing. Sorry. No, actually it was already been covered. Sorry, my transport question's been covered.
That's fine, then I'll go quickly to Assembly Member Hirani.
Previous Mayor Boris Johnson and the decision, along with George Osborne, to strip TfL of its operating grant, it's left the organisation heavily reliant on fares. And prior to the pandemic, despite that decision, the Mayor had cut the TfL's operating deficit by 71% and increased cash reserves by 13%. Given the financial situation that we are in now and TfL being heavily reliant on fares, how reliant or dependent are you on a fair long-term funding settlement from the Department for Transport to deliver the Mayor's pledges and transport commitments in the manifesto?
Well, that's absolutely obviously the nub of the discussions with government. The government wants to see TfL that can cover its own operating costs and most capital costs, and then the government contribute on the big ticket items. Question, is that achievable? Well, you can probably, when you see the government asking about, can London raise a further 500 million to £1 billion in revenue? That's starting to set out the challenge, isn't it? And what we do need is, as I was saying, long-term stable funding for TfL, and also a settlement that is responsive to the economic cycle, so that, recognising that if in a future recession fares inevitably will dip, we have a way of managing through that situation.
Okay, thank you. Very, very briefly, what progress has been made regarding pension reform at TfL, which the Mayor's independent review of TfL said could deliver savings of around £100 million per year? How are we doing with that?
Well, you'll see in the funding agreement the government's requirements about how that will progress, and so TfL is now getting that work underway.
Right, yes, and the independent review. Okay, we'll now move on to housing. So, Assembly Member Garrett, please.
As foreshadowed, if we move on to housing. So the Mayor's target of 116,000 starts by 2023, that now needs very nearly 22,000 starts per year for the next 2 years, which is more starts than any other mayor would have achieved in a single year, and we're looking at that 2 years running. How confident are you that that target will be reached by 2023?
The team believe it is deliverable. The team have a track record of, obviously the last year was exceptional, but track record of increasing the number of starts every year. They have the pipeline there to do it. Clearly, given both the economic environment and the building safety environment, which is clearly a priority for many affordable housing providers to focus on the state of their existing stock, it's going to be a challenge, but it's one that the team say that they believe can be delivered, and we're going to go flat out to do that.
I dare say there'll be many future questions. It's a couple of sort of sub-questions around that. I mean, the most obvious one is around COVID. Obviously, that has had an impact on the building industry, in particular the speed at which projects can go. So, notwithstanding COVID, you feel confident in the target?
Well, I mean, as I say, it adds to COVID, Brexit, in terms of availability of labour and so on. The impacts are not clear on all these fronts, and so there are real challenges that we just didn't, to an earlier theme, didn't know about when the 116,000 target was agreed. But the team, like I say, believe it's very challenging given these risks, but they believe it's attainable, and so they're working on that basis.
Okay. If the target isn't met, are there any impacts, for example, impacts on funding?
No, the impact is that there will be fewer affordable homes. I'm not cited on what would happen about the balance of any funding provided not used, but the key impact obviously is we want to get those affordable homes built.
And finally, I think a question that might occur to people if we've got this sort of hell for leather rush to build a lot of housing, will people either who might be living in these houses or seeing them as part of the street space, what compromises might be happening on quality, density, sustainability to hit those targets? Any?
So I guess the first thing to say is that when the overall target up to 2023 was set, that obviously was set with some knowledge about it's not just about hitting a number, it's the 116,000 watt, and you're very right to raise quality as an important consideration, and so that was taken into mind, and obviously there are all the protections and considerations from the planning system, including the New London Plan with that regard. for us looking at 21 to 26 affordable housing programme, those who are bidding for funds will have to meet some new conditions on building design and safety as well. So that includes things like minimum floor-to-ceiling heights, requirements for private outdoor space, sunlight clause so that all homes with 3 or more bedrooms are dual aspect, single aspect homes not to be north facing, and so that at least one room gets direct sunlight for part of the day, and also safety requirements around sprinklers and so on. So yeah, the funding conditions there provide some additional protections.
Okay. Thinking about the fundings, I think the Mayor has called for 4.9 billion to deliver affordable housing in London. And I suppose linking to what I was just saying, is there the capacity to actually deliver at that scale? And I suppose I'm thinking of the previous funding that the Mayor has had that hasn't been spent. That doesn't necessarily bode well for the next bit of funding all being spent.
So, well, we have a plan for spending the funding that we have got, and as I say, the 116,000 starts. The team has a plan in terms of year by year those starts, and as the committee has talked about previously, the way the funding is used is not just about starts; it's also about completion, and so necessarily some of the money sits with us until the buildings are complete. But there's absolutely plan there to use it. I think it's a very fair question to ask about the ability of the sector to deliver more housing. I think the GLA administratively, I have confidence that we could scale up and to do what we would need to do. The question about appetite of the development industry and availability of labour and resources is probably a wider one. Clearly, I think people would have, if money was available, people would have an incentive to go out there and do it if they could, because I think everybody, is in the business to try and build homes and everything, both commercial goals and societal goals that go with that. But it's a fair point to say that given where we are in terms of labour market and COVID impacts, there is uncertainties about capacity in the sector nationally, I would say.
I suppose the thought that occurs to me, you're right that if there's a lot of money available, people will rush in to grab hold of it, but that then potentially becomes an inflationary force, doesn't it, within the sector? I suppose, touching on something that you just said actually about the metrics, the Mayor's favoured metric is housing starts, but in terms of people wanting to live in a home, obviously it's a completion that actually delivers somewhere for someone to live rather than just a building site for someone to work on. So what metrics do we have around completions?
So the first thing to say is it's the government's favoured metric, and we use starts because that's what's been agreed with the government. And the general reason for that is that when a scheme starts, there's a very high degree of confidence that it will finish. Now, obviously, the officers who work with affordable housing providers are not complacent about this and will chivvy and push them along. But that's why the focus is on the starts, because we have a high degree of confidence at that point. In terms of completions, we publish those figures monthly, and so they're available on the GLA website.
Okay. I'm just looking here. I've got a figure of 39,540 homes that have been completed from the 116,000 targeted starts. So when do we think of that 116,000, assuming your answers earlier about the starts all happen on time, when would the completions be happening, do you think, for that 116,000?
So, obviously, there's a straightforward way of looking at it, which says, you're going to build a house. Okay, you build a house, it takes you, how long it takes to build from the first kind of spade in the ground, doing the infrastructure, to practical completion. What the wider factor here is obviously a number of the schemes tend to be large multi-phase sites, and the funding is secured for all those phases in order to ensure that the scheme overall is viable. And so, what you will see is that, schemes will start, the phases will start over time, and then the completions will follow those. It's probably, it's a question for housing and land officers to give you a more detailed explanation of how that will play out, but that's the essence of it.
I don't know if being unfair, that just sounded like a short while later. Would that summarise what you just said? I mean, there's nothing more tangible than just a slightly common sense, a couple of years after it starts, it'll be done.
So it will vary from site to site, because clearly some sites will be more challenging in terms of the infrastructure, etc. needed. It's not just a case of, right, the beginning is let's put in our foundations. There's often a lot that has to be done on site and infrastructure that is needed, both on site and to deliver utilities and so forth to site to enable schemes to begin. And so obviously the development process will vary dependent on the nature of each site.
Okay, moving on to the City Hall developer idea. Actually, firstly, does it have a name? Does the City Hall developer have a name?
No.
No, okay, but it's just the sort of white box City Hall developer for now. Okay. I'm just interested in the sort of outline business plan for that, in terms of roughly how many homes, costing how much, how many per year, over what time period. So, roughly what do the inputs look like and what do the outputs for that look like?
So what the Mayor's commitment was to pilot a new City Hall developer to start building low-cost homes for Londoners. And so, the Mayor's obviously determined to go even further and try and push municipal house building, including the GLA. He thinks that will give us a greater role in the design and tenure mix of housing. So that's kind of the purpose is that we're driving towards. At the moment, officers are working to look at the options for this. As you say, it's very much a pilot. We're not planning to go away and come back one day and go, right, here's a huge company. And clearly, we're not talking about putting bricklayers on the City Hall payroll. So there are a range of options that are being looked through, having to think about the land strategy, how we do delivery, who would own the homes when they're built, if they're available, if they're homes that are being rented out rather than for sale. And clearly, given the time that housing development takes, as we were just discussing, and the importance, as we also understand, in terms of ongoing maintenance and support for tenants, we are going to take a little bit of time working through that, rather than just kind of jumping in and saying we're going to do X, Y, and Z straight off the bat.
And just thinking on that point, a number of boroughs, certainly in London, have this kind of developer. And you're right, they don't put bricklayers on the payroll or chippies or anything else for that matter. It's all sort of a contracted basis. What are your thoughts on some of those, what you've learnt from some of those other developers, some of which have been up and running now for a few years?
Well, I think that's part of the purpose of the work officers are doing at the moment, is to learn from that. It's not something I'm personally cited on. We're clearly, we take a very robust and prudent approach in terms of how we as an authority manage our finances and our risk, and we're clear that will continue, and we'll need to look at practice in various boroughs to learn what lessons we can.
If I could add one thing to that from my previous borough experience, is that many of those companies set up 5 or 6 years ago were set up at a specific point in time to access some discrepancies in the funding system for new homes that probably are no longer available, and also effectively to give a right to buy shelter for many new homes, because obviously right to buy does is at risk of undermining the business case of construction of new homes. And I think clearly, as David said, we need to learn from all of that, but there were some very specific reasons why those were set up which may no longer apply.
Yeah, I mean, to be slightly parochial for a moment, as the member for Croydon and Sutton, we have one in Croydon and we have one in Sutton, and I would describe them as having been quite divergent in their outcome. So the one in Sutton started with a big fanfare and a great lot of ideas, and I would say while it hasn't caused any great problems, it hasn't also caused a great deal of ripples, and it's been quite, how would I characterise it, a bit underwhelming in its results. I think it had lots of ideas about affordable long-term rents and these kinds of things that haven't really happened. And then meanwhile next door in Croydon, it definitely has made some ripples, which I think have probably made their way all the way to here, that people are quite aware of, in the sense that it was incredibly aggressive in terms of the kinds of developments it was trying to do and the way that it approached them and the financial hole that it's got itself in. And I suppose the thought that occurs to me when I hear about this is that presumably we want to try to avoid underwhelming and also massive financial black hole. And I suppose I was curious where your thinking was, at which end of that scale of ambition the Mayor was looking at.
Well, I mean, obviously the ambition in terms of building affordable homes is very high, but you're right to highlight the risks, and that's obviously why the Mayor's commitment is to pilot, which is, to look at things, try, learn, and not make big, huge commitments that then, have consequences that, would be challenging to manage. So, and that's why, again, rather than just diving straight in, we're going to, we will look at the experiences everywhere, and, to reassure, talking more broadly than even just the housing side, I personally have read some of the reports that have been published down in Croydon around our situation, because, we take very seriously ensuring that things here are run in a prudent way, and, that absolutely will be our ethos throughout this term.
So just one final question. I don't know if I've missed it. There isn't a sort of an outline budget for this plan yet. That will come later.
So no, that will come later. It's fair to say that this is something that falls into the third of my category from earlier. That is a new thing, that there wasn't really anything in the budget to cover.
Okay. So, you've spoken a bit about. Sorry, this is finally final. You've spoken a bit about the preliminary work that's going on. Do you know roughly when we might see some outputs from that?
I don't, I'm afraid, no.
Thanks.
Okay. Assembly Member Fortune, do you still have a question on housing?
Thank you, Chair. And sort of building on my colleague's point, I read over the weekend, I think it was in the FT, that London is now one of the places where it's actually cheaper to rent than have a mortgage, which is extraordinary. And it goes to show that no matter how you measure these things, we need to complete these houses as quickly as possible. So it sounds like a good idea to set up a new developer, and I'm not surprised that Assemblyman Garrett went down the brick by brick questioning route. What's happening with current relationships with developers? Is it working well with the Mayor's office? I'm mindful of the fact that I think the largest housing association in the UK is in the building next door. How are we working with current partners?
So, I mean, it's not particularly something for me, be something Deputy Mayor for Housing and Housing and Land Senior Officers. I mean, I think we have good relationships with housing associations and boroughs. I mean, Richard may have a perspective from being on the other side of the table, if you like. But, it's clearly something that's very important to deliver the targets. We've put out, as you will know, and we touched on earlier, the funding arrangements and invited bids for the up to 2026 affordable housing programme. There's been a very strong level of interest in that, which is really positive. So, I think that's a good sign about the engagement that's in place.
So, and help me understand, I'm new, what's the driver for the new City Hall developer, if relationships are working?
So the driver was, as I said to Assemblymember Garrett, is, we think that direct delivery of homes will give us a greater role in the design and tenure mix, and we also think it might allow us to push further in terms of affordable housing. And as I said earlier, we do understand that housing associations and so forth have very real challenges at the moment around their existing stock, and so a time where there's the possibility that their focus may have to be about remediation of what they've got rather than on delivering new homes at the pace we might all like to see. I think it's right that we look at other alternatives in that context.
There's some historical context here as well, because you will be aware that the period at which London built the most homes, the then GLC was a major home builder. And there is, I think, the potential, but it needs to be explored prudently, as we've already discussed, that the GLA can add to the existing mix of local authority direct owned companies, housing associations, commercial developers and others, because we have an ability to amass sites, funding and others that potentially in an individual borough doesn't. Now that does throw up a host of questions, not least, does the GLA want to be a housing manager, which I think is a very significant shift indeed in our current set of responsibilities. And that's why it's completely prudent to think of to get the answers to these big questions before we progress down this route. But there is a potential long-term gain here if the GLA can get this right. But I think it's right that we start small to manage what I think has potentially enormous benefits to Londoners, but needs to be done prudently.
So I think it's a great spot to talk about the repairs side of the business. I think if you speak with any sort of housing association, they'll say it's the repairs that are the real challenge, and that will lay on layers of bureaucracy and cost to the Assembly and risk, I think, as well, that we need to be very mindful of. Just very quickly to scoot back to David, when you talked about having more control over the design and the tenure of the buildings, has that been an issue with some of our partners, housing partners?
Well, I guess every scheme will have its own challenges and limitations, and every organisation putting it forward will have its own priorities, and I'm sure there will be schemes where officers would look at it and will say, oh well, maybe if it would be nice, we would have like to see it done a bit differently, and so they will obviously work with partners and try and have that input, but there's obviously a limit to how far that can take you, and obviously control gives you well, the clues in the name, control.
Yeah. I mean, having some background in this area, I'd be really keen to be kept closely informed with how that develops, if you'll excuse the pun.
Okay, thank you. Just one very quick one, going back to the manifesto. The Mayor's manifesto said, or the Mayor said in his manifesto, in his usual fair and even-handed tone, he said, we mustn't allow the Tories to wind the clock back to letting developers get away with focusing on building luxury flats. So is there a definition of a luxury flat from the Mayor?
You would need to direct that at Housing and Land colleagues. It's not something that I would...
Okay, could you get the answer to that for us? Because clearly then I am assuming that the Mayor would no longer allocate affordable homes funding to those developers. So it would be nice to know what the Mayor regards as a luxury flat. So if we could receive that, we'd be grateful. We'll now move on to the policing sector, and that's going to be led by my colleague, Assembly Member Fortune.
Sunday was a particularly sad and shocking day across London. I think 6 people shot, 13-year-olds stabbed, police attacked. It is clearly vital that we have sufficient numbers of police officers on our streets. So, looking at the allocation of 6,000 police officers by 2023, how confident are we that they're going to be delivered?
So obviously, Assembly Member, that's a decision for the government. The Commissioner and the Mayor have been clear that of the 20,000 officers that the government is funding nationally, London should have 6,000 of those, and fundamentally it's important to understand that given the growth in London's population through recent years, that would just put us back in terms of the number of officers per 1,000 Londoners back to where we were 10 years ago. So it's not about kind of advantage to London against the rest of the country. It's just putting us back where we were, and the Commissioner and the Mayor will continue to make the case to government about that, and obviously we will have to see what conclusion the government reaches later this year.
Yeah, so I understand that we're getting the sort of funding formula share of officers. What do you think will be the implication of that if we don't get the full 6,000?
So I think the implication is that it ties in with another issue that we have, that the government underfunds the National International Cities Capital City grant by the reckoning of the government's own independent review by somewhere just over £150 million a year. Now, those duties which necessarily fall on the Met as a consequence of policing the capital are not things that they can just ignore, and we can't just step away from policing demonstrations or embassies or all the various other duties the Met has. And the consequence of that is that there is less resource for neighbourhood policing in London and the BCUs around London. And so I think what you can certainly see is that as these additional officers have come on stream and continue to come on stream, the Commissioner, obviously an operational matter for her, has been as much as possible directing those into BCUs, as that's where she sees the greatest need as.
And I guess, going back to what we were talking about earlier with Assemblyman Deval was talking about bidding for the Olympics, about having bigger and more impressive sporting events here. We're going to need to have that capacity in policing if we're going to make those bids. Now, the extra 1,000 police officers that we currently have, how long is that funding going to continue for?
So that funding was originally set as being done through business rate growth, which the then CFO said that prudently could be afforded. Obviously, we've hit some issues with business rates, as the committee will be aware. And so we have got a reserve in place that the Mayor prudently put aside of £120 million, which was there recognising that there were some technical changes being discussed by the government that could have delayed our receipt of business rate growth. The government's yet to reach a decision on that, but as it happens at the moment, there's no business rate growth to distribute in any case. So what we are doing is drawing that reserve down so the cost of the officers is very roughly £60 million a year, and so that reserve will draw down at £30 million a year, and that will be complemented by £30 million a year from the rise in council tax that took effect this April. And so those officers are funded for at least 4 years now until March 2025, and we will, as financial situation develops over that time period, clearly need to look at how we ensure that funding continues to be available.
So in terms of the sustainability of current funding, it's coming from those reserves reducing and increasing in council tax. Is there any other way that's been investigated at how this could be funded, or could be put into a sustainable funding model?
So fundamentally, income for policing comes overwhelmingly from either government grant or from mayoral funding, which has to mean council tax or business rates, and clearly business rates is very limited. There's some limited income sources, such as Heathrow Airport, a good example, where people pay for policing services, but clearly that's limited. And so, fundamentally, I'm afraid it comes back to the questions of either London taxation or national grant funding.
And there's no, because I know that there were suggestions put forward previously about other ways to put it onto a more sustainable model.
As I say, we were in a position where we had a sustainable model pre-pandemic, and we made prudent provision for changes around the business rate system. So we have an approach that works for now. Clearly decisions will be made across the course of the next 4 years regarding council tax, regarding National International Capital Cities grant, regarding government grant funding, etc. So we'll have to just see how all that plays out.
Okay, so Londoners are likely to see further increases in council tax to fund policing.
So the strategy of the government over the last decade has been to shift the burden of the cost of policing away from, as a percentage, away from the government and towards the council taxpayer. And one of the things that we had to deal with in our first budget, for the 2017-18 budget, was where the government reduced the funding that it was making available to us for policing, because in the 2016-17 budget, the previous mayor didn't increase council tax by the amounts the government enabled. And so, yeah, what we've learned, and we see in the government's setting out all the government's assumptions and figures, always assume a maximum council tax rise. Yeah, it's worse than that. Say in the 1 year when there wasn't the maximum rise in the police preset through the decision of the previous mayor, we were actively penalised for that by the government.
So yes, there's likely to see increases in council tax to pay for policing.
So that seems to be the government policy about what it expects to happen. I've heard nothing to say that's going to change.
Part of the council tax, but sure. So how will the mayor use his role to hold the MPS to account? I'm thinking there's been some criticisms recently of interventions. How will the mayor scrutinise the MPS? How will he work with them to ensure that they're performing their duties efficiently?
Well, that obviously happens through a wide range of processes, from the mayor's direct meetings with the commissioner and deputy commissioner, similarly in terms of the deputy mayor, and then the governance structure and oversight structures that MOPAC has in place to carry that out. Okay.
There was some criticism of the mayor recently after the vigil, after the sad case with Sarah Evnard, where I think Sir Thomas Windsor talked about a certain degree of uninformed commentary, particularly on social media, saying that it wasn't helpful in terms of the police doing their job.
So I can assure you that the mayor's comments about the policing of the vigil following this tragic death of Sarah Everard were informed comments. The mayor met with the commissioner and deputy commissioner and spoke with them at length to understand everything from their perspective, and so the mayor's comments were most definitely informed comments.
Okay. There's been a lot of talk about building bridges with the government. So how will the mayor work with government now differently to perhaps how he had done in the past?
So, we are very much wish to work with government, and that needs it needs to be at all levels. In terms of the mayor's relationships with secretaries of state. I know the mayor had, for instance, a very constructive and positive conversation with the Transport Secretary at the conclusion of the recent funding deal, and it absolutely remains our desire to do that. And whether it's at ministerial level, senior official level, we're really keen. We think there's an awful lot of overlap between the policy objectives of the government and the mayor, and so we're very keen to work constructively together, just as we have in terms of COVID response and indeed vaccines as well, which I believe the vaccine minister recognised recently.
And then specifically around policing, working with the Home Secretary, relationships there are good or improving?
Absolutely. I think it's been a while since the Mayor and the Home Secretary met. I think we certainly would be keen to meet and discuss some of the issues facing policing in the capital, which, as you I think alluded to earlier, is clearly a very significant part of national policing. But also, we continue that engagement, both through MOPAC officers, but also through the Met as well, who clearly have a close relationship with the Home Office.
Okay. Did you say it's been a while since they met?
We certainly haven't met since the election. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the last date was. Certainly the Mayor's Diary is published periodically in any case, so you'll be able to look at that.
Okay. Turning to tech, there's an investment of, I think it's 190 million, 187 million in new MPS technology cover. Is that included in the current budget?
Yes, I think that reflects the MPS's transformation programme, which encompasses a number of different aspects. Some of the probably the two really significant ones to understand would be firstly the contact response system that is used, if you dial 999, 101, whatever it may be. That is a very old system. I think I'm right in saying it even dates back to the 1980s. It is probably on its last legs, if not kind of beyond that point. I know under the previous mayor there was an attempt to replace it, which didn't work out, and so there is a new project there running to address that. And then the other thing is some of the main police systems that police use in their work. I think from memory there are 6 or 7 different systems which don't talk to each other, and there are significant issues around rekeying and efficiency, as well as the age of some of these systems, which really date from, there's a kind of historic Met culture, which was a bit, we're the Met Police, we'll create our own IT and create their own bespoke systems, which can have some benefit, but is absolutely not the way to do it in the longer term, because you step away from the ability to maintain and respond and integrate with other systems. And so those are two absolutely key projects that are underway at the moment.
Okay, I don't like to think of the 80s as being that long ago. Starts to make I'll get a wiggle on because I can feel the
Can you
chair's
feel
eyes.
it?
I can feel the eyes.
Good.
The manifesto talks about. I'm learning. The manifesto talks about increasing visible neighbourhood policing, which I think everyone agrees is a great idea. How's this going to be achieved? How's it going to be funded? What are the sort of costs of it?
So, I mean, obviously we're fundamentally there talking about officers, and that brings us back to the allocations of officers who will be recruited through this year and next year, given the additional funding that the government have made available. What the Met is doing at the moment is a piece of work to look at where is the best location for these teams. And what I guess is an important driver for this is it's about trying to ensure that police officers are put where they're most needed. I think there was a high degree of support for the situation we found ourselves in 15 to 20 years ago, when we could say every ward had, was it 1 sergeant, 2 constables, 3 PCSOs. But obviously not all wards are equal in terms of the challenges that the police deal with. And also we have to recognise the geography. So just thinking of 2 examples that pop into my head, Lewisham Town Centre is pretty much in 1 ward, whereas Tooting Town Centre would be across 4 wards. And so a model that's just ward-based isn't necessarily going to meet the operational requirements the police face. And so the work the Met is doing is really doing the analysis to say, well, right, where should these teams be? Where's the greatest need? How do we then, as we necessarily build over time, do we roll them out? Do we say, okay, right, we're going to get, here's the officers for team number 1, we're going to put that team there. When we've got enough officers for team number 2, we're going to put it there. Or are we going to kind of start teams off in more places, but they would be smaller and they would grow over time? And so that's the policy and analysis work that the Met are doing at the moment. And then it will be a case, obviously, as these officers are recruited, go through their training, then how we set those teams up. But obviously, equally, it's not just a case of going, right, here are, I don't know, 5, 6, 10, whatever number you want, new officers fresh out of Hendon, right, you go, there's the new team. as ever, the Met has work to do to ensure new officers are suitably trained and experienced. And so it will be a case of probably a lot of them will go into existing teams, and then when there's through a combination of existing officers and new officers with some experience, you've got that kind of critical mass, will then be able to establish the teams.
So do we, because I'm just aware of time, do we have any sort of time scales for that? When do we know how will we know it's working?
So, effectiveness of police officers, I guess, is a subject many people have written PhDs
I didn't
on.
really mean effectiveness. I mean, when are they going to be deployed? When will we start to see boots on the ground, as they say?
So that's something the Met's looking at the moment, and the question is, are we going to get there in this financial year, yes or no? Given the needs for training and officers to get experience in order to ensure that these teams are effective, I'm not certain that we'll get there in a meaningful way this financial year, but that's something that obviously, I'd say, the Met's looking at, and clearly we're keen to have as soon as we can, but the teams are not just there to tick something off, they're there to be effective and serve Londoners.
Absolutely. I think that's my
Okay,
time.
lovely, thank you. Did you want to ask a supplementary?
Quickly, in terms of the 187 million investment in technology, you mentioned 2 of the systems. Is any of that money being used to further improve digital forensics in the Met, in particular the rollout of kiosks at stations?
So that's it's a capital budget. So
This isn't capital, the 187.
So no, I believe 187 was a capital figure.
Must be.
So the investment in digital kiosks wouldn't
So,
be
but, so
capital?
digital kiosks may form part of that, but generally the Met Transformation Programme has been about the kind of big strategic challenges related to its IT infrastructure. So like the things I talked about, like its ability to manage data, building on the work that we've had with, say, Body One video rollout and the rollout of mobile devices to officers. So it's very much in that spirit. The kiosks has tended to be something that's been done when additional funding has come available, such as the Mayor's allocations through business rate growth.
Okay, well, perhaps when we write after this we could get some clarification on the investment in digital forensics and the kiosks. Thank you.
Yes, I absolutely agree. We'll definitely be
Thank
coming
you.
back to that one. And there's no doubt but the MPS need quite a bit of investment in technology. We've come across that, those of us that have been on the
Yes.
police committee. We're now moving, excuse me, on to fire. So I'll go over, please, to Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair. The Mayor has committed to, quote, fight hard for the right levels of government funding, so there are no frontline cuts to the fire brigade. What does the Mayor think is the right level of government funding? Why, and what is that based on?
So I think there are probably 3 things that need to be addressed to, on top of current levels of funding to do that. The first is building safety work. There's been one-off funding from the government, which, pleased to say, has been extended into this year as well, to enable the brigades to do the work they're currently doing, looking at the some 8,000 high-rise properties around London and their safety. But clearly, all this analysis is going to need to be on a recurring basis, both as new buildings are built and as work continues on existing buildings, whether remediation or maintenance and renewal. So the first thing we're going to need to do is get that right. The second thing we need to ensure we get right is the right funding in terms of the brigade's counter-terror and other emergency response capabilities. And, that is clearly something that is beyond the traditional role of a firefighter, and we have arrangements in place in London at the moment, but there's a desire to take those on to the next level, but there are obviously resourcing implications related to that. And then the third thing is pension costs, where the government has been providing on a one-off basis annually most, but not all, of the funding needed to meet costs in the pension scheme that they introduced. But we've had a challenge in that every year it's been a case of waiting to see whether the government is going to make that money available, and we need to get that built into the base settlement. I think that's very much it on the operating side. I think the other side we need to think about is the capital side as well, and ensuring that the Mayor's made a great investment in some of our the equipment the brigade uses. It's important, particularly in response to Grenfell, it's important we can continue to do that, but it's also important that we continue to invest in the fabric of our fire stations, obviously a great many of which are very historic buildings, and we need to ensure that we're providing appropriate, good, decent facilities for all our firefighters.
Okay, thank you. We saw from the fire in East London in early May that cladding is still very much a live issue. The Mayor's manifesto commits to pressing the government for action to ensure that no leaseholder has to pay for fire safety defects in their homes that they had no part in creating, including pressing for the swift introduction of a levy on major developers, which could raise more than £3 billion to help pay for this work. How has the government responded to these requests from the Mayor?
So at the moment, obviously the government has set out its position in terms of the funding it's providing, the funding it's not. I think there's a very strong and effective community of campaigners who are impacted by this issue, who I think have very effectively set out some of the flaws in the government's approach. My personal view would be that clearly there are very large sums involved, but the current approach is inequitable, and the government is going to need to go further. And the Mayor will continue alongside the campaigners and other politicians continue to make that case.
But specifically in terms of the Mayor's idea of a levy on developers that he proposed to the government, has there been any response from the government?
So I don't think the government has said anything specifically beyond setting out what their position is in terms of their approach. But we will continue to make the case.
Okay. And finally for me, how will you ensure that the LFC is adequately prepared to deal with the requirements of the fire safety and building safety bills? Okay,
well, I think the key to that is understanding, obviously, what those, One Now and Act, what the requirements actually are. So while the Fire Safety Act received royal assent a couple of months ago, it's not yet in force, and we're waiting the guidance that the Home Office and the National Fire Chiefs Council are working on to the Act, and that will actually be pivotal in terms of what the requirements are on the brigade and how it has to go out about implementing it. So, it's only really when we get that the brigade will understand what the implications of the Fire Safety Act are, and so obviously we're keen to get that as soon as we can before the commencement date of the Act, which we don't know when that will be yet, but we believe it will be either the end of 2021 or early 2022. And then in terms of the Building Safety Bill, so obviously we still wait the formal publication and the parliamentary process for that, and we will obviously start trying to understand the implications of that legislation when it's available and as it changes and goes through that. And the other consideration, obviously, is important, is the new building safety regulator, where the government has said the Health and Safety Executive will take on that role. And so both the Brigade and the National Fire Chiefs Council will work closely with the new regulator, and already have had a number of meetings to start that engagement and get that mutual understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Did you have a supplementary?
I'm following up from Assemblymember Clark in terms of the fire and cladding safety scandal. Actually, the Mayor's manifesto makes minimal reference to it, and I accept that a lot of the issues are with government. But has any consideration been given within your budget planning to introduce perhaps a support hub from City Hall to offer those caught up in the scandal support in the same way you've offered EU citizens applying for settled status support with their hub?
I think the two situations are not entirely comparable, because obviously your EU citizens is a very disparate group of individuals, whereas those affected by this issue, the nature of it and the impact on them tend to mean that they're grouped together and getting advice. Clearly, the Mayor is, has been involved in, lobbies of Parliament with the groups, and meetings have been had, and so we have relationships with some of the groups, and want to help where we can, but I think it's less about information, for instance, on the GLA website, and it's more about continuing to make the case to government. That's the priority.
Okay, thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you. And this brings us to the last section, which is on the environment. So I'll hand over to Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair. The pandemic saw improved air quality initially, although traffic has since increased. So what investment will you be taking forward to regain the cleaner air that Londoners tasted during the first lockdown as the restrictions are all eased?
Forgive me, just trying to find the right section in my briefing. I think there's a number of different things that the GLA can do itself. There's also areas where we can work with boroughs, and you're right, poor air quality comes from a number of different sources, one of which is the transport network, and a lot of the work we've been doing around active travel, and others do have direct intentions to improve air quality, and there's been a very, very significant air quality result of that. I mean, the game changer is ULEZ expansion. There's a lot of investment going, as you know. That project is on course to be completed in October. The first ULEZ was transformational in terms of London's air quality. ULEZ expansion will be even more so. We're also looking at a range of other changes. Some of the kind of transport changes we've already talked about, some of the investment in TfL, about some of rolling stock and things like that do change air quality there. But the game changer in air quality is ULEZ expansion.
Okay, and so you've confirmed that you're on track for the rollout in October. Are you aware of any other things like zero emission zones? Are you allowing for investment in those, or any other measures apart from the ULEZ?
So there's a range of investments that we are looking at. So if you're looking at the TfL stock, there's further investment in zero emissions buses, and some other changes around the stuff that's under TfL's direct control. We're also looking to set up, so forgive me just why, the creation of a £1.5 billion clean air fund with at least 52.5 million for London to match. So we're lobbying for the government to create a £1.5 billion clean air fund with money to match the Mayor's scrappage scheme. So the Mayor has put forward money to support Londoners with ULEZ expansion, who we understand have got vehicles that they need to replace as part of that. We've put forward what we can in the financial circumstances. We can support a scrappage scheme. I think that's a fair and reasonable thing to do, and we're looking for further government support to expand that out. I think based on the sympathy many of us have for people who bought diesel vehicles in good faith, being told that they were clean with some government subsidy for that, and it transpires actually that they have enormous impacts on air quality.
So that 1.5 million Clean Air Fund, is that something new now, or is that what has been planned?
Sorry, I should clarify. We're lobbying. That's the thing we are currently calling for the government to establish.
Okay, so do you have a timescale on when you're likely to hear about that?
No, we don't at the moment. But again, we would hope so out of a comprehensive spending review in the autumn.
Okay. And you mentioned zero-emission bus fleet. Now, I think the plan is to have a zero-emission bus fleet by 2037. So do you know what the cost of that is going to be? And are you going to be asking central government for all of that funding, or are there other sources?
David, do you mind taking this one? Because it's a TfL.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I mean, obviously, it's worth saying that both London has a leading position. We've got the largest fleet of electric buses in Western Europe. We're now at 5% already electric, and we're going to see that increase over the next year to around 800 buses, which is about 9% of the fleet. Yeah. And the Green New Deal fund that the Mayor's got will invest in the design and delivery of power infrastructure at bus garages in London. We're going to do a pilot at 2 garages to learn from that. We think the cost of a zero-emission bus fleet, if we're going to try and deliver it by 2030, is around £1 billion, of which around 300 million is needed for charging infrastructure. So that's what we think the scale of the cost will be, and clearly to start delivering that is going to need TfL to have the capability to invest in it, which is tied back into the funding position we talked about earlier.
And is that part of the funding discussions with government, or is that for a future discussion?
So the government is very focused on financial sustainability of TfL, and so their focus is very much on the operating account. Obviously, if we're going to talk about investment in garages and so forth, well, this is big long-term capital stuff, and so that needs to come as part of the discussions for the spending review, because we need to have long-term certainty of funding for TfL's capital programme, and we are being very clear with government that the TfL's financial sustainability plan set out our desired scenario, which included delivery of what, to be fair, are the government's policy objectives as well as the Mayor's. I think we're united in the desirability of a quick move to electric buses, and the question is how we get a funding arrangement in place that enables that.
Okay, thank you. So then the Mayor has a goal to make London zero carbon by 2030. So what are the key levers and actions that are available to the Mayor to deliver this? And do you need new investment to make that 2030 carbon neutral goal a reality?
I mean, the quick answer to your second question is a big yes. So the Mayor, as you know, had set out a descent target towards 2050, and that work is to take that towards 2030 is currently being updated at the moment. I mean, the Mayor has been persuaded, as I think is a growing scientific consensus, that if we're going to stick at 1.5 degrees of temperature increase, that 2030 is the right date. But clearly, given we're already well into 2021, that is enormously ambitious. But frankly, if you don't set the right ambition, then you're not going to achieve anything. The kind of figures we're talking about, if we're going to get that, it has been estimated, are looking, somewhere in the region of £61 billion is the current working figure, which is clearly way beyond any budget that the GLA has, or frankly even the central government has. However, I don't think there's any expectation, given quite a lot of the technologies needed to get there are probably viable commercial propositions, that the state should be expected to fund all of that. So one of the things that is coming out of the work at the moment is to look where there may be room for a commercial market in green kind of green technology and green infrastructure can develop. One of the areas we're looking at as part of the Green New Deal is to significantly expand the green job sectors coming out of the work of the Recovery Board and the Recovery Task Force. And a key part of that actually is looking about ways in which we can make sure that Londoners benefit from this transition. As this transition becomes part and parcel of city life, the more and more people are going to be employed in things that contribute towards zero carbon. So it is a massively ambitious target. The bill is eye-watering, but we need to start somewhere, and it's critical that we can deploy all of the levers that we have to do that.
Thank you. Then the pandemic saw levels of public transport usage decline. What new investment is going to be needed to get back on track with the 80% of all journeys being walked, cycled or made by public transport by 2041? That kind of refers back to the question I asked earlier actually about the that gap between street space and the old Healthy Streets budget. But is there anything else that you feel needs?
Well, I'll give a stab at answering that question, but some of the more transport-related stuff, because actually one of the big things is we need to get confidence back in public transport as the pandemic clears and get ridership of tubes and buses up again is actually going to be the biggest single contributor that we can make to a direct answer to your question. I think after that, I think we are actively looking at ways in which we can further increase active travel. I mean, obviously, I think this is a really interesting time to look at that in the light of the pandemic, where we've seen enormous change in infrastructure across London in 15 months at using techniques I don't think we would have considered potentially viable beforehand. And actually what we found is, in my personal experience, and possibly yours too, is there's enormous public appetite for it. And I think so I think the ways in which we learn the lessons of the last 15 months, both about what is supportable by the public and what is done at efficiency and at cost, are pretty critical to all of that. And I know the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor's Walking and Cycling Commissioner are kind of actively working with officers at the moment to try to establish that. And that does, to a degree, give us a sense of what future budget allocations may be needed in this area. Mm-hmm. The current budget allocations are very much tied up in the TfL funding deal. I mean, Dave, you want to add anything about that?
Well, no, I mean, it just built, I guess there's probably two things to say. One is it just builds back on, the point about the TfL budget, and, TfL's ability to invest is determined by, it's the availability of capital funds after it's, the costs of running the network. The other thing to say that we're very mindful of is with the ULEZ expansion this October, well, that's, is going to cause some people to consider their behaviours, and both in the, do I really need to drive to do this journey because I will have to pay an extra cost, if I do so, and there'll be some others who will think, well, actually, do I really need to keep a car? Actually, is this an opportunity just to move away from using the car and always walk, cycle, use public transport? And so some of the messaging in the run up to that, once we've done the work about the base awareness of the change, is going to be important, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, it'll be certainly very interesting to see just how the impact of the pandemic in terms of how we change, how much we move around and how we move around. So my final question, the Mayor has said that he's going to bring together the GLA group, that includes TfL, the MPS and the LFB, to use existing land and infrastructure to support the rollout of the more than 44,000 electric charging points that the city will need by 2030 to support electric vehicles. So how many of these 44,000 charging points will be delivered by the GLA group?
So this is a project that is running under the Group Collaboration Board, which I chair, and really what it's about doing is saying, well, do we have land within the group that is available and suitable for use for rapid charging? And we believe that we do. Probably from memory a majority TFL, but probably to some extent every organisation in the group does have some land that may be potentially suitable. And so the project is kind of in its design phase at the moment, and what it's trying to do is both look at some sites in more detail and say, are they suitable? Because obviously you've got to consider the nature of the power network in the area, as well as other considerations about the site and how it would tie in with the road network. But also then the commercial model around this. There are a number of companies who produce and operate rapid charging devices, and so what is the best commercial model? It's certainly something that there seems to be a significant degree of interest in, and so we are working on that at the moment, and that project should come back in the autumn with a view and a set of proposals about how best to move ahead. One of the things that we're trying to ensure we do as well is do this in a very open and collaborative way, to ensure that boroughs can take part of it as well, because obviously there will be borough land that would be good for rapid charging points, and also there's the potential, dependent on the approach adopted, of an income stream for this, which I'm sure, just as GLA group organisations would, boroughs would welcome as well.
Mm-hmm. Can I just make a request that if you are looking at these sort of commercial models, that you consider the needs of pedestrians, because some of the placing of electric vehicle charging points can impact on pedestrian amenity, particularly for disabled people, with interruptions on footways and things like that. But
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm sure that's a fair point, and sort of thing that exactly the TfL team work on that you would expect to take into account. I mean, obviously, the question is, to what extent do you take the approach like you see some streets? Oh, here are 2 rapid charging, hubs points, or where do you say, well, actually, here's a hub where you've got 10 or more brought together, which is much more, I guess, comparable to a petrol station.
mm-hmm. Yep, thank you.
Assembly Member Hirani.
A bit on the theme of ULEZ and EV cars as well, and just looking at other countries as well, and the support that's provided to switch to electric vehicles, thinking in particular to our EU, ex-EU fellow countries, Germany and France, where they have more generous schemes for customers who want to switch to EV vehicles and grants, whereas we seem to be going the other way in the UK, and we saw a recent reduction from £3,000 to £2,500 in vehicles and in grants available to vehicles, and also a smaller selection of vehicles that will be eligible for the grant. Just wondering, in the absence of kind of government action on this, is there anything the Mayor's Office is doing to work directly with car manufacturers to think outside the box a bit and maybe encourage them to look at finance deals for Londoners trying to get EV cars, for example?
Yeah, so we've, I think you're right in terms of the position of the government, and obviously the Mayor was able to do a little bit more in the budget last year to top up his scrappage scheme, but clearly it is small compared to the potential demand. I'm not cited, I'm sure TfL are having conversations with the motor industry. I'm not particularly cited on them. That's certainly something I can look into, because I imagine that there will be a range of in any case a range of offers around car finance that are out there. I guess the question would be, what value TfL will be able to bring to that, or to what extent organisations will be able to go further in terms of they'll probably they may make it more attractive in terms of, well, here's a scrappage payment, but then because it's done on a commercial basis, doubtless the driver would be paying back those costs in some other way over time through the lease or however it worked. So I'm sure that these organisations are not blind to the huge impact that the extension of ULEZ is going to have, because clearly it's going to be a major driver of change in the car market in the next 6 months and beyond.
I think in truth the biggest change we can make to demand for electric vehicles is to make sure London residents are confident there's an active network of chargers out there. I mean, the biggest thing that, thinking about my previous job, was that it's a bit chicken and egg, that people don't think there's chargers, they don't change vehicle, and if they don't change vehicle then there's not enough demand and people don't get on with providing chargers. And I think the work that David talked about earlier about making sure that Londoners are confident there's an active network of chargers out there is probably the biggest kind of demand-led change we could make.
I agree with you to some extent, but I think that there's a core issue of actually these vehicles being far more expensive than petrol, diesel and hybrid vehicles as well. So I think we need to look at the upfront costs as well.
But that is absolutely changing at pace. And again, it's as demand shifts over to electric vehicles, then the huge economies of scale of motor manufacturing will come into play. And fundamentally, an electric car is more straightforward because of the complexity of the combustion engine. So people do. There's a debate, I think, about when, but there is an acceptance at the point it's going to be reached when electric cars are cheaper, and clearly demand will be pivotal to that. And I think Richard's right. The single best thing we can do for demand is ensure that rapid charging points are available in the city and give people the confidence that they can switch and they'll be able to do the motoring that they need to.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the fact that Enver hasn't had any questions, so two completely non-political ones, Enver. The last answer we had, which was for the cost of expanding the ULEZ, was around 120 to 130 million. Is that broadly correct?
I believe it is. I haven't had an update that's any different from that, if you can hear me.
Have you got a better update, David?
I haven't heard any suggestion that there's been a change in costs. So
can we have confirmation of that, because we're looking at a vast amount of money here. How many cameras will or have been installed to cover the expanded zone?
I wouldn't possibly have that number off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
Can we have that answer as a matter of urgency? Because obviously they're going to be littering up. I mean, I know lots of people are all for this ULEZ. You do know the views of some of us. And earlier, David, you did say that this will make people change their habits. I must say to you that isn't always possible, and this will hit the poorest and shift workers the most, and that is the reason so many of us are against this. But
it's also the poorest who are most impacted by air pollution, and it's their lives that are at the heart of this.
We have to agree to differ on that from various different angles. But anyway, thank you everybody very much. I'd like to thank our guests for attending this morning and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. And can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the GLA group monitoring reports for Q4 of 2020-2021? Just to tell you that the report from the LFB has not included, as it's not yet been published, and will be reported at the next meeting. Can I ask the committee to note the report on section 11? And can I ask the committee to note the Mayor's decision list? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leads to agree any further responses arising from this committee's review of the impact of COVID-19 on the GLA's finances. Thank you. The next meeting of the committee will be confirmed in due course by the London Assembly. I have no other urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everybody. There we go.